An official good afternoon, everybody. It is officially after 12 o'clock. Good to see you all. And we are talking about the stigma of mental illness. And I am so excited to have two wonderful guests with us. Dr. Samantha Boardman is a psychiatrist, a positive psychiatrist here in New York City. She works at Weill Cornell Medical Center and is the founder of Positive Prescription and the author of Everyday Vitality. Dr. Michael Lindsey is somebody who studies child and adolescent mental health. He is also the director of the Institute for Poverty Policy here in New York and about to be the incoming dean of the School of Social Work at NYU. So welcome, everybody. So let's begin. The stigma of mental illness. I think stigma is one of those things that we sort of know it when we see it, but sort of hard to describe. And why are we talking about it now as it relates to mental illness? And Dr. Boardman, let me begin with you.
Sure, I think sometimes stigma is a word that we sort of throw around and it's lost meaning. There are really two important ways to think about it. There is that public stigma, that negative attitudes that people have about those with mental illness. And then there's also that self-stigma that people have, they've internalized sort of negative views about themselves, and this sort of self-blaming and shame that can kick in. And where stigma is so powerful here is that it can limit your ability to seek help, to stay in treatment, to have relationships, to thrive, to achieve your goals. And also, in addition to sort of affecting individuals, Perri, it really affects us as a society as a whole because it sort of limits our ability to celebrate sort of neurodiversity and the contributions that those with mental illness are making.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. So, Dr. Lindsey, stigma matters. You study youth and adolescents. What are the kinds of stigma that you worry about for this group, and do they experience it differently than adults do?
Yes, it's a great question. Thank you, Perri. It's important to note that adolescence is a time when kids are trying to understand who they are, develop their identity, and differentiate themselves from their family. And so add on to that struggles with mental health issues that, as Dr. Boardman said, are incredibly stigmatizing. And so that's one thing that really matters then in terms of what youth are struggling with is their identity on top of the struggles with mental health issues, really make them have really difficult times connecting with friends. And so the other part that's really important is that families often can play a critical role. And sometimes mental health issues are poorly understood. So for example, it could be that a child is struggling with a mental health issue, but it's interpreted as being lazy, or they're having difficulty with school assignments, and so it's interpreted as they're not wanting to do their schoolwork. And so those kinds of things add on to the pressure and stress of what a mental health challenge might mean for an adolescent.
It's such a good point, and we're going to circle back to that. But Dr. Boardman, something that you said in the first question, which is barriers to getting the help that we need. And we know that mental health treatments work, or can often work. Talk to us a little bit about how stigma actually prevents people from getting care.
Yeah, well, over 50% of people who have a mental health diagnosis don't seek care. I mean, it's striking. And that stigma is born out of a lack of understanding and a lack of fear. And frankly, all too often, mental health conversations are led by people like me, like psychiatrists or people in white coats. But it's actually when we hear from those whose lived experience is of mental illness that people can relate to, that reduces those barriers. If you kind of, as Tory said earlier, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And having those relatable stories really reduces these barriers to seeking treatment. And young people, we know when they receive a diagnosis, they're much more likely to look for a blog or somebody talking about their experience. And that can be really, really powerful.
You know, when we talk about mental health, mental illness, there was, as I was doing the research for this conversation, Dr. Lindsey, looking at the data for suicide, specifically among Black youth, there was a number on the paper, I thought it was a typo, but it wasn't. What's going on, and can you give everybody here a sense of what's happening in that space?
Yeah, so just to bring everyone on board with what we're talking about, we did a study and we found that high school age youth from the years 1991 through 2017 saw, particular black youth saw an increase of 73% in suicide attempts, while every other racial and ethnic group saw a decrease in suicide attempts. We then analyzed data from 1991 through 2019, and this is data from the CDC, and we found that the rate had actually increased by 144% for black youth. Now, some of the reasons we're seeing or trying to understand, because we really don't have the data to help us to be definitive about what the reasons are, but some of the things we're seeing is the disconnection from treatment for kids who actually need to be connected to treatment, and so stigma plays a huge role. We often find that behaviors are often, as I mentioned earlier, misinterpreted, and so there's implicit bias with respect to how black and brown kids present with behavioral issues in terms of being suspended from school versus receiving behavioral health supports. And I think the other thing we have to pay attention to is over the last 20 years or so, we've seen an increase in violence in the community, particularly for people who are unarmed and come into contact with law enforcement. There is a such thing as vicarious trauma, and there's a study out of Harvard that suggested that if you're black and you live in the vicinity of a police shooting of an unarmed black person, you're likely to report more days of psychological distress versus if you're white and you report no days of psychological distress. And so there is vicarious trauma that is impacting kids.
That's interesting. You know, it's sort of intuitively that makes sense. I didn't realize there was a name. That's really useful. Let's talk about loneliness. And Dr. Boardman, it's something that you actually study about and care about. We've all experienced loneliness. Is it actually dangerous, though?
Absolutely, and actually, Gen Z has been called the loneliest generation, and there's obviously a difference between loneliness, that is that feeling of isolation, of feeling unloved and disconnected, versus that state of being alone. And look, you can be in a room of 1,000 people and feel terribly lonely. And loneliness can be an on-ramp to mental health issues, and also it can affect our physical health. You've, I'm sure, seen the data looking at how it's the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And that's where it's so powerful, I think, sometimes when we hear exemplars and people in the media come out and talking about their experiences and their challenges with mental health, is because I think it helps us fight that perfectionism. And perfectionism is on the rise, especially in young women. Just this idea that one has to be perfect socially, physically, professionally, in every way. And to have the generous examples of people sort of pulling back the curtain, talking about their stressors, their challenges, sort of pulling back on some of that toxic positivity, on all this pressure to be perfect, can really, I think, help inoculate us against that sense of perfectionism and loneliness as well.
How can schools play a role as we sort of pivot into the part of the conversation about solutions? Why do schools matter?
Well, first and foremost, we know that in the United States, if kids are going to receive mental health treatment, it is most likely to happen in schools. Schools are now the largest provider of mental health services and supports for kids. And so that being the case, schools can play a critical role by actually having mental health professionals available in schools. Oftentimes we find it is the case that a mental health provider is only there on Wednesday of 1 week, right? And so what happens to the other days when kids might need that support? And so what we've been advocating for at the federal level is for all schools to have a mental health provider, and it should be proportionate to the number of kids in schools. Oftentimes it is the case that if a provider is available for 1 day of the week, that provider is actually trying to serve thousands of kids. And so there needs to be a provider proportionate to the number of kids in schools. And so rather than have one behavioral health professional or mental health professional, it should be multiple ones.
So you say you've been advocating for that in
Yes.
Washington. Are you making any progress?
Yeah, we made some progress. We are actually now advocating for the passage in the Senate of the Pursuing Equity and Mental Health Act, which has requested the expenditure of resources to provide behavioral health providers and mental health professionals in schools to be proportionate to the number of kids in schools.
Because mental illness is, as they say, a shadow pandemic, and this
That's
is
right.
really, really serious, especially when you highlight those numbers that you were referring to about suicide. Dr. Boardman, let's talk about talking. You touched on it. How can we talk better to help people recover?
Well, I also think about what Dr. Lindsey just spoke about now is thinking about so much of the promotion of mental health and the prevention of mental health issues occurs outside of the clinic. It occurs in schools, it occurs in playgrounds, in cafeterias, on sports fields. And I think all too often, psychiatrists are very deficit-based. I mean, I was trained to look for what's wrong, to try to problem solve. I ended up getting really good at misery. And, the point is not focusing enough on what makes life worth living for somebody, what is meaningful to them, what sort of gives them a spring in their step. And when you speak to people who have mental health challenges and say, what do you care about most? Yes, they want better research. They want a greater understanding of what's happening with them. But they, in addition to that, they also want to have a better day. They want to feel more vitality. They want more energy in their everyday lives. And I think also sort of shifting the focus to what is meaningful to them and having this sort of both and, not either or approach, and helping people find wellness within their illness and strength within their everyday stress is really powerful.
Dr. Lindsey, here we are, I think, coming out of the pandemic, maybe not, maybe, but nonetheless, young people are able now to gather. They're back in school, they're out. Are things getting better out of the pandemic in terms of mental illness and mental well-being?
I think that there's greater recognition of the importance of connecting to mental health providers. Certainly during the pandemic, we facilitated opportunities for youth and families and individuals all around to be connected to mental health services through psychiatry and telehealth services. So that's a positive. I do think that connecting to those providers creates greater access, which has been also a challenge. If you go out and you're looking for a mental health professional, you may be challenged by finding one that's
especially
proximal.
if you're feeling depressed.
Yeah, proximal to where you are. And so I think the opportunity to have that connection to someone via telepsychiatry is really important. It's creating greater access. And so I think that is a positive thing. And certainly the sort of stigma and barriers related to mental health treatment have they've basically almost gone away. We still have some
That's
challenges
great.
related
That's
to it.
positive.
But more people are talking about it and seeking professional help, and that's a great thing.
No, there's no question. And Dr. Boardman, same question for you, but pivot to loneliness. Is that getting better now that people are sort of emerging from their Zooms?
Well, sort of the cocoons, and I think we had sort of, for anybody who had social anxiety, that social distancing really greenlighted that. It was good. It was a healthy response, but actually re-entry has presented a huge challenge, I think, for many of us. And with the, avoidance of anxiety-provoking situations is many of our knee-jerk responses, but it's actually when we sort of expose ourselves to situations that make us feel a little bit uncomfortable that can get us over that hump. And so helping people navigate that, I've been talking to a lot of patients about sort of that social hangover they've been feeling and feeling really overwhelmed by being around people again, and really suggesting and recommending that they really cherry pick the situations, the social situations they choose to enter, and they really aim for those opportunities and contexts where they can find meaningful conversation, which is, I think, one of the secret sauces of well-being.
As we look out to everybody and we're talking about mental stigma and mental illness, what is something that each and every one of us, I'm going to ask both of you this question, and Dr. Lindsey, I'm going to begin with you. What can each of us do to help reduce and tone down the stigma when it comes to mental illness?
I think the most important thing that we can do is to first take stock of ourselves, our challenges with respect to reaching out for help when we need it, and really protect our peace and engage in activities, relationships that are going to be meaningful to protecting our peace. But the other thing that's really, really critical is that you can be a supportive friend, family member that encourages that loved one who is coming to you to reach out for professional help, to not feel like they have to struggle with that challenge on their own. And if you have to accompany them to an appointment or figure out some way to make it possible for them to go if they feel like they're challenged with being able to go to a therapist, be that person, that support person, because it could make all the difference in the world in terms of their well-being and their life.
Same question for you. What can we each do to tone down the stigma?
I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Lindsey. Talks about in terms of creating this scaffolding around oneself and with that, those social connections that are so powerful. But also language really, really matters, the type of language that we're using when we're discussing this. There's a study that shows that when even clinicians talk about a schizophrenic versus a person with schizophrenia, it shifts the way their attitudes, their expectations, their belief in this person's potential. But in addition to that, I think even just the way, if somebody is coming to talk to you about their challenges, maybe just out of a knee-jerk response, we could say, oh, just smile, or I'm sure you're going to feel better tomorrow, or sort of diminish their experience, or buck up. And, I went through this last week, and all with the best intentions, but actually, what are those things we can say that are helpful? And it is, can I drive you to that appointment? How can I help? I'm so grateful you shared that with me. And sometimes it's not even about language. Sometimes it's just bearing witness, holding their hand, walking side by side with them, showing them that you care deeply about them, and providing that experience of felt love. Because sometimes there are no words, but there are ways to show love.
It's such good advice. And Dr. Lindsey, I hate to do this, but in the 25 seconds that are left, you get to be the voice of optimism. What do you feel good about when it comes to this topic? No pressure.
I feel great about the fact that we're having this conversation.
There you go.
And the more that we can talk about something, the more that we can take stock of it and address it.
Dr. Michael Lindsey, Dr. Samantha Boardman, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice.